Everyone calls it the end of the world, but that's not quite what Ragnarok is. Tonight, we're going through the full lore, what Ragnarok actually is, where the prophecy came from, who knew about it, and how every single event in the Norse saga was quietly pulling toward it, whether anyone wanted it to or not. Calm the whole way through, no loud noises or jumps, perfect for winding down or falling asleep. Please subscribe and like if you enjoy. It helps the channel grow and tells me you enjoyed the video, which means a lot. Part 1. Groa and the First Vision. The origin of the vision began with a personal search. Groa wasn't looking for the end of the world, but for the location of her husband, Orvandil. She used her unique gifts to peer into the shifting strands of existence, hoping to find a single soul lost in the cosmic mist. Instead of a husband, she found a violent truth that reached across time. Her mind was flooded with images of a dying mountain and a falling king, a sight so massive it nearly shattered her spirit before she could record it. This was the first complete map of the apocalypse, a vision that didn't just show a future, but a conclusion to every story ever told in the Norse realms. This revelation didn't stay contained within her mind. The energy of the vision caused a magical surge that rippled through the fabric of the cosmos, a pulse of power so distinct that it was felt in the high halls of Asgard. The Allfather, who had spent his life listening for the whispers of fate, recognized the signal immediately. He knew that someone had finally seen the full shape of the end he so desperately feared. He didn't wait for an invitation or send a messenger. He moved with a clinical focus, cornering the seeress in her own home before she could share her discovery with the rest of the giants. When the Allfather arrived, he didn't ask for a consultation. He demanded a total surrender of her knowledge. Groa realized that the god standing before her was the very monster she had seen in her dreams, a man who would hollow out the world to save himself. She refused to speak, choosing to protect the truth of the giants rather than serve the hunger of a tyrant. Her silence was a final act of defiance that drove the king into a quiet rage. He realized that a living prophet could keep a secret, but a dying one might be forced to reveal it. He moved to end her life, his hands closing around her throat to stop her breath. The murder of Groa was a moment of specific and calculated cruelty. As the Allfather strangled her, he used his dark magic to strip mine her mind, attempting to pull the images directly from her fading consciousness. He didn't want the poetry or the context of the prophecy. He wanted the data points of his own survival. He saw the fire and the sword, but he missed the heart of the message because he was too busy looking for the exit. He believed he was taking the truth by force, unaware that a dying seer has one final weapon that a god cannot counter. Groa used her final breath to weave a massive deception into the very fabric of the prophecy. She knew that the Allfather was watching her thoughts, so she projected a version of the future that was designed to lead him into a trap. She showed him a universal apocalypse, a total destruction that would claim every realm and every soul. She made the end look so big that he wouldn't notice the small details of his own vulnerability. She died with a secret in her eyes, leaving the king with a map that was actually a maze. It was a masterpiece of narrative resistance, a lie that would define the next 3 centuries of divine strategy. The fallout of this event was a world that was moving toward a destination that only one person truly understood. The Allfather returned to his lodge with a heart full of stolen visions, convinced that he had the information he needed to win. He started to build his defenses against a total annihilation, ignoring the targeted nature of the actual event. He didn't realize that the prophecy he held was a corrupted file, a ghost in the machine of his own ambition. Groa had been silenced, but her final choice had ensured that the end of the world wouldn't be the end of the giants. It was the first move in a game that would eventually break the mountain. Part 2. What Ragnarok actually meant. The general understanding of the prophecy was a masterclass in divine misdirection. Most beings believed that the final battle would result in the total annihilation of the 9 realms, a fire that would leave nothing but ash. This was the version of the story that the All-Father used to keep his subjects in a state of permanent fear. He wanted his people to believe that their survival was tied to his own, making the defense of Asgard the defense of the world. However, the secret truth hidden in the stones of Jotunheim told a very different story. The giants knew that the coming storm wasn't a universal end, but a surgical strike against the high halls of the Aesir. This distinction was hidden within certain Jotnar shrines that had been scattered across the realms by Tyr. The god of war had worked with the giants to preserve the true history of the future, away from the prying eyes of his father. These shrines used a form of vanish magic that made them invisible to anyone who carried the blood of the Aesir or the intent of a conqueror. They recorded a future where the other 8 realms survived the fire, while Asgard alone was unmade. It was a prophecy of revolution rather than extinction, a promise that the weight of the mountain would eventually be lifted from the shoulders of the universe. The giants didn't hide this truth just to spite the All-Father, but to protect the other realms from his desperation. They knew that if he realized he was the only target, he would burn the rest of the world to create a buffer for himself. By letting him believe in a universal apocalypse, they forced him to play a defensive game on a global scale. He spent centuries building a war machine that was designed to stop a cosmic event, wasting his resources on a plan that didn't match the reality of the threat. He was preparing for a flood while the giants were sharpening a single, precise blade. Ragnarok was actually a targeted destruction that aimed to dismantle the specific system of control that the Aesir had established. It wasn't about the death of the trees or the oceans, but the death of the hierarchy that sat on top of them. The fire of Surtur was a cleansing force meant to ignite the core of Asgard, leaving the rest of the world to find its own way back to the light. This was the hope that Faye had carried when she chose her husband and raised her son. She knew that the end of the age was the only way to give the world a beginning that wasn't written in the Great Lodge. The confusion over the meaning of the prophecy was a weapon that the heroes eventually used to their advantage. While the All-Father was focused on the cosmic signs, Kratos and Atreus were building the alliances that would provide the boots on the ground. They didn't need to save the universe. They just needed to break the walls of the city. This shift in perspective allowed them to act with a moral clarity that the gods lacked. They weren't fighting for a throne, but for the freedom of the realms to exist without a master. The giants had provided the vision, and now the Spartan was providing the muscle to make it real. When the horn finally blew and the war began, the difference between the lie and the truth became terrifyingly clear. The other realms didn't crumble, and the sky didn't fall on Midgard. The fire was directed, and the violence was focused on the one place that had caused the most misery. The All-Father watched as his kingdom was unmade, realizing too late that his centuries of preparation were based on a misunderstanding of the giant's art. He had been tricked by a dead seer and a hidden shrine, a final irony for a god who thought he owned the future. Ragnarok was a precision strike, and Asgard was the only target that mattered. Part 3. The signs that could not be stopped. The countdown to the end of the age was defined by 3 fixed points in time that even a god couldn't erase. These signs weren't just events, but triggers that activated the final sequence of the prophecy. The first was the death of Baldur, an event that seemed impossible given the protection spell his mother had placed on him. When Kratos ended the life of the invulnerable god, he didn't just kill a man, he triggered the start of the 3-year Fimbulwinter. This was the moment the world realized that the old rules were broken and that the All-Father's law was no longer absolute. It was the first tolling of a bell that would never stop ringing. The second sign involved the theft and eventual return of the moon, a celestial event that led to the final chase of the wolf giants. Skull and Hati had been held in a state of arrested motion by the All-Father's magic for centuries, a desperate attempt to stop the clock of the world. He believed that if the sun and the moon were never eaten, the apocalypse could be delayed forever. But the heroes realized that a frozen world was a dying world, and they worked to restore the natural cycle of the heavens. When the moon was returned and the wolves were freed, the celestial hunt reached its conclusion, plunging the realms into a state of cosmic darkness. The third and final sign was the Great Darkness, a moment of profound silence that signaled the breaking of the Gjallarhorn. This wasn't a natural shadow, but a metaphysical weight that sat on the hearts of every living soul. It was the visual and spiritual signal that the sequence of events had passed the point of no return. The horn, blown by the keeper of the gate, was the sound of a world that had finally accepted its fate. Once the horn sounded, the army of the realms began its march toward the mountain. The All-Father's time had run out, and the signs he had tried to cage were now the chains that bound him to his end. Odin's attempts to prevent these signs were the very things that ensured they would happen. He had stolen the moon to keep it safe, but that theft created the imbalance that forced Atreus to intervene. He had bound the wolves in Asgard, but that imprisonment made their eventual release a vital part of the rebellion. Every move he made to cage the prophecy only served to fulfill the timeline he was trying to avoid. He was a man who was building his own prison with every brick he laid. He didn't realize that a prophecy isn't a wall that you can climb, but a river that carries you along regardless of which way you swim. This self-fulfilling nature of the timeline was the ultimate tragedy of the Aesir. They were a race of warriors who thought they could fight fate with steel and surveillance. They spent centuries monitoring the seers and hunting the giants, trying to find a loophole in the laws of the universe. But the more they tried to control the future, the more predictable they became. The giants had seen this predictability and had written the prophecy to account for it. They knew that the All-Father would try to hide from the end, and they used his own fear to guide him toward the very cliff he was trying to avoid. The 3 signs were the milestones of a journey that Kratos and Atreus had to take together. They didn't start the fire, but they were the ones who had to tend to the flames. Each sign was a lesson in the weight of their choices and the reality of their heritage. They saw the world change around them and realized that they couldn't just stay in their forest. They were part of a larger story, a cosmic cycle that required them to be the champions of the wronged. The signs were a bridge to the future, a path that led through the dark to a world that was finally, gloriously free. The arrival of Fimbulwinter was a moment of primordial magical resonance that vibrated through every root and branch of the world tree. This wasn't a natural change in the climate, but a reaction to the violation of the cosmic order. It acted like a massive shedding of skin for the realms, a transition period where the old energy was being purged to make room for the new. It was a 3-year winter that sat on the world like a heavy blanket, a period of mourning and preparation that affected every living thing. It was the sound of the universe's breath hitching before a final, violent scream. In Midgard, the winter manifested as the Great Frost, a cold so absolute that it froze the Lake of Nine solid and turned the forests into a white wasteland. The sun was a pale ghost in a grey sky, and the air was filled with a constant biting wind that drained the life from the earth. But this wasn't the case in every realm. In Alfheim, the winter took the form of a desert storm, a violent shifting of sands that buried the ancient temples and choked the light of the elves. In Svartalfheim, it was a toxic smog that rose from the deep mines, a heavy mist that turned the industrial heart of the dwarves into a landscape of poison. The lore implies that the nature of the magic involved was tied to the age and the spirit of each specific realm. As Mimir noted, primordial realms like Muspelheim and Niflheim were almost entirely unaffected by the winter. This was because these realms are the source of the heat and the cold that the winter was trying to mimic. They were too ancient and too raw to be touched by a resonance that was meant for the younger, more structured worlds. They stood as constants in a shifting universe, a reminder that the fire and the ice of the beginning would be there at the end. They were the anchors of the world, and they didn't care about the seasons of the gods. Fimbulwinter was also a period of slow, spiritual rot for the inhabitants of the Nine Realms. The constant dark and the relentless cold wore down the resolve of the mortals and the gods alike. It was a test of survival that favored the strong and the desperate. The magical protection staves that had held the monsters at bay for centuries began to flicker and fail, allowing the horrors of the underworld to bleed into the world of the living. It was a time of ghosts and raiders, a landscape where the only law was the law of the hammer. The winter was a mirror that showed the world its own reflection, and the reflection was a cold, dying thing. The All-Father viewed Fimbulwinter as a delay in his search for the mask, a 3-year obstacle that he had to manage with his dwindling resources. He tried to ignore the suffering of the other realms, focusing his attention on the defense of Asgard and the surveillance of the Spartan. He didn't see the winter as a cleansing force, but as a technical problem that needed a solution. He spent his time in the Great Lodge, listening to the reports of the freezing world and waiting for the snow to stop. He was a king who was disconnected from the reality of his own kingdom, a man who was trying to rule a world that was already slipping through his fingers. Ultimately, Fimbulwinter was the necessary prelude to the final act of the prophecy. It was the darkness that made the coming fire look like a gift. It forced the heroes to leave their home and to find the strength they would need for the war. It turned a boy into a man and a god-killer into a father. For Kratos and Atreus, the 3 years of waiting were a period of survival training that hardened them for a war that was no longer a myth. They learned to live in the cold and to fight in the dark, a preparation that would prove vital when they finally reached the walls of the city. The winter was ending, and the end was just beginning. Part 5. Fimbulwinter, a century early. The death of Baldur was the moment the divine clock of the world was smashed by a Spartan's fist. According to the original prophecy that the All-Father had spent centuries studying, Fimbulwinter wasn't supposed to arrive for another 100 years. The gods had expected a long, slow decline that would give them plenty of time to find the mask and secure their escape hatch. They were living in a world of comfort and order, convinced that the end was a problem for a different generation. But Kratos was a chaos variable who didn't follow the schedule of the Norse world. By taking the life of the invulnerable god, he shortened the fuse on the apocalypse by a full century. This acceleration sent a wave of genuine panic through the halls of Asgard. The Allfather realized that his meticulously crafted timeline was now a pile of useless parchment. He had expected to have decades more to find the missing pieces of the mask and to peer into the rift without dying. Instead, he was suddenly facing a 3-year deadline that he wasn't prepared for. He had to accelerate his surveillance, his recruitment, and his infiltration of the other realms. The sound of the world's clock speeding up was a noise that kept the king awake at night, a constant reminder that he was no longer the master of the story. The shortened fuse changed the nature of the Allfather's strategy. He became more desperate and more willing to take risks that he would have avoided in the past. This led directly to his decision to infiltrate Sindri's house, a high-stakes undercover operation that required him to live like a beggar for months. He had to be in the room where the heroes were planning their rebellion, hoping to steal a scrap of information that would give him back the advantage. He was a god who was running out of time, and he was ready to burn every bridge to find a way out of the fire. His desperation was the engine that brought the end even closer. For every other soul living in the 9 realms, the early arrival of Fimbulwinter was a catastrophe that felt like a betrayal. They had been told that they had a century of peace left, and now they were suddenly huddled in the dark and the cold. The markets in Midgard were abandoned, the mines in Svartalfheim went quiet, and the forests grew thick with the dead. The people felt that the gods had failed them, a realization that began to erode the authority of Asgard long before the first horn was blown. The acceleration of the prophecy was a wound to the collective spirit of the world, a moment that proved the gods were just as vulnerable as everyone else. Kratos and Atreus were the only ones who didn't seem surprised by the change in the schedule. They had lived their lives in a state of constant preparation, and for them, during the early winter was just another challenge to be overcome. Kratos saw the acceleration as a sign that his past was finally catching up with him, a debt that he was ready to pay. Atreus saw it as a call to action, a reason to finally step out of his father's shadow and become the champion the giants had predicted. They didn't panic. They practiced. They turned the 3 years of winter into a masterclass in survival, a period that would define the rest of their lives. The century of lost time was the ultimate irony of the Allfather's reign. He had spent his life trying to control the future, and his own actions were the thing that had stolen it from him. He had created the very warrior who would break his clock. As the snow fell and the wind howled, the king realized that he was no longer the one who was telling the story, and he was just a character who was trying to stay on the stage for one more scene. Fimbulwinter was a century early, and the Allfather was a century late. The end was arriving on its own terms, and no one in Asgard was ready for the sound of the final bell. Part 6. 3 years of waiting. The 3 years of Fimbulwinter were a period of intense, quiet transformation for the realm of Midgard and the people living within it. The most obvious change was the state of the Lake of Nine, which froze into a vast white wasteland that stretched to the horizon. The naval hub that had once been the center of travel between the realms was now a frozen desert, a landscape where the only way to move was by sled and wolf. The great statues of the gods were buried in snow, their marble faces looking down on a world that had forgotten their names. The geography of the world had been simplified by the cold, a white silence that covered the ruins of a civilization. For Kratos and Atreus, these years were a period of survival training that hardened their bodies and their spirits for the war that was coming. They lived in a state of constant, high-alert readiness, their days spent hunting for food, and their nights spent watching the perimeter of their home. Kratos didn't offer a life of comfort or a future of peace. He offered a life of competence. He taught his son how to kill a man in the dark and how to track a god in the snow. He was a father who was preparing his child for a world that didn't have room for a single mistake. They were no longer a man and a boy. They were a unit of survival. The magical protection staves that Fae had placed around their home centuries before finally began to flicker and fail during the second year of the winter. Without her constant care and the energy of the world to sustain them, the barrier grew thin, allowing the horrors of the outside world to bleed into their sanctuary. Hellwalkers, the frozen dead of the underworld, began to swarm the woods in search of the living. Raiders, driven mad by the hunger and the dark, attacked anything that moved. The forest was no longer a home, but a battlefield where the only rule was to stay alive until the sun rose. The peace of the early years was a memory that was buried under the ice. This period of waiting was also a time of intense psychological pressure for Atreus. He was a teenager with the weight of a prophecy on his shoulders, a boy who knew that he was destined to be a champion, but didn't know if he was ready. He spent his nights studying the scrolls and his days testing the limits of his own magic. He felt the pull of his giant heritage and the responsibility of his godhood, a dual nature that threatened to tear him apart. He grew distant from his father, his mind always focused on the secrets of Jotunheim and the fate of his people. He was a bridge that was being built in the middle of a storm. The slow deterioration of the world's protective magic was a sign that the 9 realms were reaching their breaking point. It wasn't just Kratos' home that was vulnerable. The very fabric of reality was starting to tear. The ravens were more aggressive, the storms were more violent, and the ghosts were more present. Everyone who was relying on the old magic to keep them safe found that the gods were no longer listening. The universe was shedding its skin, and the process was a painful and messy catastrophe. The world was waiting for the end of the winter so that the fire could finally begin. Ultimately, the 3 years of Fimbulwinter were the bridge between a tragedy and a revolution. They provided the time necessary for the heroes to find their resolve, and for the Allfather to lose his mind. They turned the 9 realms into a powder keg that was waiting for a single spark. Kratos and Atreus stood on the shore of the frozen lake and looked toward the mountain, a father and a son who were finally ready to finish the story. They had survived the wait, and now they were ready for the war. The winter was over, and the final signs of the prophecy were already starting to appear in the sky. Section 3. Odin's War Against Fate. Part 7. The Mask and What Odin Believed. The central focus of the Allfather's obsession during the final years was a broken mask of foreign origin and a glowing green tear in the basement of his lodge. This mask was a relic covered in languages that didn't exist in any of the 9 realms, a fact that both terrified and exhilarated the king. He believed that the mask was the only object in existence that could allow him to peer into the rift, a literal tear in reality, without being destroyed by the energy within. He saw the rift as the source code of the universe, a place that held the answers to the meaning of life, death, and the purpose of the gods. To him, the mask wasn't just a piece of history. It was a cosmic key. His belief in the mask was driven by a deep, existential insecurity about his own mortality. He had spent his life manipulating prophecy and managing the future, yet he still couldn't escape the certainty of his own end. He believed that if he could look into the rift, he would find a way to step outside the laws of fate entirely. He wanted to find an escape hatch, a path that would allow him to become a being that existed after the end of the realms. He wasn't interested in saving Asgard or his family. He was interested in transcending the story itself. He was a man who wanted to be the author of a universe that had no end. The mask was more than just a tool for knowledge. It was a symbol of the All-Father's refusal to accept his own limitations. He viewed the world he ruled as a small, insignificant cage, and the rift was the window to the true reality. He spent his days and nights obsessed with the missing fragments, sending his spies to the farthest corners of the cosmos to find a single chip of the stone. He didn't care about the lives that were lost or the kingdoms that were ruined in his search. He was a god who had traded his connection to his people for a connection to an object, a transition that left him more isolated than he had ever been in his long life. This obsession is what led him to recruit Atreus, the only being with the talent for languages and the connection to the spirit that could finish the work of the mask. He saw the boy as a specialized piece of equipment that he could use to reach the truth. He offered Atreus a place in his lodge and a seat at his table, using a facade of fatherly validation to hide his own cold intent. He didn't see a grandson, he saw a key. He was willing to manipulate a child's curiosity to achieve a goal that would eventually destroy everything the child loved. He was a craftsman of the soul who was working on his final and most dangerous project. The lore implies that the All-Father's belief in the mask was a form of madness that colored every decision he made in the war. He stopped being a general and started being a treasure hunter. He ignored the tactical reality of the rebellion and the threat of the Spartan, convinced that once he had the answers from the rift, none of it would matter. He believed that knowledge was the ultimate power and that the mask would make him a being of infinite wisdom. He was a god who had forgotten that a king's strength comes from his people, not from a stone. He sat in his basement and whispered to the green light, a man who had already left the world before the fire had even started. In the end, the mask was the ultimate bait that the universe used to lure the All-Father to his destruction. It was a physical manifestation of his own greed and his own fear, a relic that promised him everything and gave him nothing. When the mask was finally broken and the rift was closed, the king lost his mind because he realized that there was no escape hatch. He was just a man in a room, facing the consequences of a life spent in the dark. The mask was a lie, the rift was a void, and the All-Father was the only one left to watch the walls come down. He had searched for the source code and found only the end of the line, Part 8, capturing Skoll and Hati. The All-Father believed that the celestial mechanics of the universe were a gear he could jam with enough force. By seizing the wolf giants who chased the sun and moon, he attempted to freeze the transition of day into night. He kept Skoll and Hati in a state of arrested motion within the borders of Asgard, surrounding them with magical restraints that prevented them from reaching their prey. To Odin, these wolves weren't just animals. They were the physical triggers for the third sign of the apocalypse. He reasoned that if the celestial bodies were never consumed, the final darkness could never arrive to signal the end of his reign. He turned the natural rhythm of the sky into a prison, proving that he feared the movement of time more than any rival god. This attempt to control the wolves confirmed exactly how the All-Father understood the three signs of the prophecy. He saw them as a sequence of mechanical events that could be stopped if a single link in the chain was broken. He didn't view the signs as symbolic warnings, but as physical requirements for the war to begin. By caging the wolves, he felt he had gained a strategic advantage over the seers of Jotunheim. He spent decades watching the sky, satisfied that the sun and moon were safe under his watchful eye. He was a king who had mistaken the symptoms of the end for the cause, unaware that his interference was the very thing that made the end unavoidable. When the heroes eventually freed the wolves and returned them to the safety of Vanaheim, they didn't just perform an act of mercy. They pulled the final pin on a grenade that the Allfather had been holding for centuries. The release of Skoll and Hati allowed the celestial hunt to resume with a frantic energy that had been building during their long imprisonment. The wolves were no longer just following instinct. They were fueled by a divine need to finish the task that had been denied to them. By trying to delay the end, Odin had ensured that when it finally arrived, it would strike with the force of a coiled spring. The giants had anticipated this move and had prepared the landscape of Vanaheim to act as a sanctuary for the twins. They knew that the wolves were the keepers of the light, and they used their magic to shield them from the ravens. This rescue mission was a pivotal moment in the rebellion, as it proved that the heroes could dismantle the Allfather's defenses at the highest level. It showed the realms that the sky didn't belong to Asgard anymore. The movement of the sun and moon was restored to the hands of the giants, a transition that signaled the beginning of the end for the Aesir's control over the world. Odin's plan to cage the wolves was a perfect example of the narrow thinking that defined his rule. He was so focused on the technical details of the prophecy that he ignored the spirit of the world around him. He didn't realize that a universe held in a state of arrested motion is a universe that will eventually break. His cage wasn't a solution, it was a delay that made the final explosion even more devastating. He sat in his lodge and watched the sky, believing he was the master of the clock, while the wolves were already preparing to swallow the light. He had traded the natural balance for a temporary peace that was as fragile as glass. The return of the wolves to the sky was the visual signal that the final phase of the war had begun. The people of the realms looked up and saw the celestial chase resume, realizing that the Allfather's law was failing. The darkness that followed was the shadow of the giants' victory, a moment of silence that preceded the fire. Odin watched the eclipse from his balcony, realizing that his most effective defense had been turned into the signal for his destruction. He had tried to stop the time, and the time had simply walked over him. The wolves were free, the sky was dark, and the end was arriving exactly as it had been written. Part 9. The False Prophecy. The grand deception that defined the final age of the Aesir began with a single lie told by a dying seeress. Groa didn't just show the Allfather a vision, she showed him a version of the future that was designed to bankrupt his spirit. She told him that Ragnarok would result in the total destruction of every soul and every realm in the cosmos. She described a universal apocalypse where the stars would fall and the earth would vanish into the void. This big lie was the weapon she left behind, a narrative trap that forced the king of Asgard to play a defensive game on a scale he couldn't possibly manage. He believed he was fighting to save the universe, while he was actually just providing the engine for his own removal. This misinformation shaped 30 years of the Allfather's strategic thinking in entirely the wrong direction. Because he believed that everyone was the target, he felt he had to manage every variable in every realm. He spent his resources monitoring the elves, the dwarves, and the humans, trying to prevent a disaster that wasn't even aimed at them. He viewed the apocalypse as a global wildfire that needed to be contained, rather than a precision strike aimed at his own front door. This resource drain was exactly what Groa had intended. She turned the Allfather's genius into a liability, making him focus on the horizon while the enemy was already in the basement. The fear of total annihilation turned the Allfather into a cautious and reactive ruler. If he had known that only he and his city were the targets, he might have been more ruthless earlier in the struggle. He might have ignored the other realms and focused his entire military might on a single, preemptive strike against the rebellion. But because he thought the whole world was at risk, he tried to be everywhere at once. He built defenses that were too thin and surveillance networks that were too broad. He was a general who was defending a continent when he should have been defending a room. The lore suggests that Groa's lie was the most effective piece of magic ever used against the mountain. It worked because it appealed to the Allfather's ego. He wanted to believe that his death was so significant that the entire universe would have to die with him. He couldn't imagine a world that continued to breathe after the Aesir were gone. This vanity blinded him to the gaps in the prophecy, allowing the giants to hide the truth within the stones. He spent his life preparing for a cosmic end, while the giants were preparing for a political change. He was a man who had been given a fake map and had followed it to the edge of the world. This deception created a state of permanent exhaustion for the Aesir military. They were constantly on high alert for signs of a universal collapse, a tension that drained the resolve of even the strongest warriors. Thor and the others were sent on endless missions to secure the borders of realms that weren't even part of the actual war. The Allfather's obsession with the big lie meant that he was always out of position when the real threats emerged. He was like a builder who had spent his life fireproofing the ocean while his own house was made of wood. The lie was the foundation of his strategy, and it was a foundation made of sand. When the truth was finally revealed at the walls of Asgard, the Allfather realized the scale of the deception. He saw that the other realms were thriving, even as his city burned. He realized that the end of the world was actually just the end of his rule. The giants had outsmarted him from beyond the grave, using his own fear to ensure his destruction. He stood in the wreckage of his lodge and saw that the universe didn't care about his passing. The big lie had served its purpose, leading the king to the exact spot where the fire was waiting. He was the only one who died in the end of the world, a final joke from the seeress who had seen it all. Part 10, What Odin Did to Prevent It. The Allfather's prevention list was a series of desperate moves that functioned as the primary engine for the apocalypse. Every action he took to stop the prophecy was a step that brought the heroes closer to his door. He believed he was dismantling the threat, but he was actually providing the materials for his own destruction. The first major move was the genocide of the giants, a campaign of slaughter designed to remove the only people who could see the future. But by killing the seers, he ensured that he would never know the truth about Groa's lie. He had blinded himself in an attempt to hide from the dark, a choice that left him vulnerable to the very truth he had tried to erase. The binding of Freya was another tactical mistake that backfired with poetic precision. By stripping the Vanir queen of her wings and her spirit, the Allfather thought he had neutralized his most dangerous enemy. Instead, he created a resentment that would eventually unite the realms against him. His cruelty gave the Vanir a reason to join the war, turning a peaceful people into a focused army of revenge. He had taken a woman of the light and forced her to find her strength in the shadow, a transformation that produced the very general who would lead the final invasion. He had built his own executioner out of the ruins of his marriage. The imprisonment of Tyr was perhaps the most ironic of the Allfather's defensive moves. He kept the god of war in a cell to prevent him from becoming a martyr or a leader for the giants. But this imprisonment was the very thing that forced the heroes to travel to the mines, a journey that consolidated their alliance and revealed the rot of the Aesir's industrial machine. The search for Tyr was the catalyst for the rebellion. a mission that turned a group of survivors into an organized force. The All-Father had hidden the key to his own destruction in a basement, and then he had shown the heroes exactly where the basement was. His infiltration of Sindri's house was a final, desperate attempt to regain control of the narrative. He lived as a fake Tyr for months, spying on the group and trying to steer them away from the war. But this infiltration led to the murder of Brock, an act of violence that created a personal hatred in the Huldra brothers. This hatred was what provided the heroes with the Draupnir spear, the only weapon capable of breaking the defenses of the Aesir. The All-Father's attempt to be a spy had given his enemies the very tool they needed to kill him. Every lie he told was a thread in the rope that was slowly tightening around his neck. The All-Father's list of preemptive strikes was a masterclass in self-destruction. He manipulated Thor into a state of broken self-loathing, ensuring that his strongest warrior would eventually lose the will to fight. He manipulated Atreus into a search for the mask, ensuring that the boy would eventually find the courage to break it. He was a man who was playing a game of chess against himself, and he was losing every move. He saw himself as the master of the board, but he was just the one who was providing the pieces for the other side. His prevention list was actually a set of instructions for the end of the world. The lore suggests that the All-Father's failure was a result of his inability to trust anything he couldn't control. He saw the world as a series of threats to be managed, rather than a community to be led. By treating everyone as a potential enemy, he ensured that they eventually became one. His defenses were the very things that invited the attack. He sat in his lodge and watched the walls grow higher, unaware that the danger was already inside. He had spent his life trying to stop Ragnarok, and he had succeeded in becoming the only person who made it necessary. He was the architect of the end, and he had built it to his own specifications. Section 4. The Players in the Prophecy. Part 11. Kratos in the Prophecy. The appearance of the ghost of Sparta in the halls of the Norse world was a variable that the giants had been tracking since the fall of Olympus. They saw a man who had already murdered a pantheon and realized that he was the only being in the cosmos with the specific experience needed to finish the work in Asgard. The murals in Jotunheim depicted him as the god from a distant land, a figure of shadow and fire who would arrive just in time to dismantle the Aesir. Faye chose him not just for his strength, but for the chaos variable he represented. He was a being from outside the Norse system, a man whose existence was a challenge to the idea of a fixed and predictable destiny. Faye understood that a man who had destroyed the Sisters of Fate in Greece was a man who couldn't be controlled by the threads of a Norse Norn. Kratos was the ultimate insurance policy for the giants. He was the muscle they lacked and the resolve they needed to face a god like Odin. She saw beneath the armor and the rage to find a man who was capable of a profound and protective love. She knew that if she could bind him to the world through a son, he would become a shield that no hammer could break. He was a tool of the end that was being molded into a protector of the beginning. The irony of Kratos' role was that he spent the entire campaign trying to avoid being the instrument of destruction. He had seen the cost of a war against the gods, and he didn't want to pay it again. He wanted a quiet life in the forest, a wish that the giants had used as the very bait to lure him into the war. He didn't realize that by trying to save his son, he was fulfilling the very prophecy he was trying to outrun. He was a god-killer who was trying to be a father, a conflict that made him the most unpredictable and dangerous being in the 9 realms. He was the only one who could say no to the All-Father and make it stick. Kratos' past in Greece was the foundation of his power in the Norse world. He brought with him the weapons of a dead world and the experience of a man who had seen the sky fall. He wasn't afraid of the Aesir because he had already seen what happens when the unbeatable gods are brought low. This perspective was his greatest weapon against the Allfather's psychological games. He couldn't be bribed with a seat on the council, and he couldn't be threatened with a cage. He was a man who had already lost everything once, and he was ready to lose it again to protect the boy. He was the ghost of a past that was coming to haunt the future of Asgard. The giants saw Kratos as the great leveler, the force that would clear the way for the new world. They didn't want him to rule. They wanted him to break the board so that someone else could play the game. They recorded his journey with a clinical precision, knowing that his arrival was the only way to ensure the survival of their spirit. They saw the blood on his hands as a necessary price for the freedom of the realms. He was a being of total destruction who was being used to build a world of total choice. He was the Spartan, and he was the only one who didn't care about the prophecy. The presence of Kratos in the Norse world was the final sign that the Allfather's reign was a terminal condition. He was the infection that the universe had produced to kill the cancer of the Aesir. He moved through the snow with the weight of a dead pantheon behind him, a man who was already a legend before he ever picked up an axe. He was the father of the champion and the killer of the king, a dual role that made him the center of the world's attention. He had destroyed the gods of the sun and the sea, and now he was arriving to finish the god of the storm. He was the end of the story, and he was the only one who was still standing. Part 12. Atreus as the champion. The prophecy that centered on the champion of the Jötnar was the source of the most intense tension between the father and the son. While Kratos saw the coming war as a tactical problem to be solved with steel, Atreus saw it as a spiritual rescue mission for the souls of his people. In the light of Alfheim, the boy saw a future where he was the one who united the disparate realms under a single banner. He wasn't just a soldier, he was a diplomat and a leader who could speak the language of the elves, the dwarves, and the Vanir. He was the Loki of the prophecy, a being who possessed the empathy and the vision that the Allfather lacked. This role as the champion was something that Atreus embraced with a youthful and dangerous idealism. He believed that he could fix the world by fulfilling the script that the giants had written for him. He wanted to be the hero of the story, a desire that Kratos viewed with a deep and protective suspicion. The Spartan knew that being a champion usually meant being a sacrifice for the benefit of others. This conflict defined their relationship throughout the winter, as a son tried to find his destiny and a father tried to keep him safe from it. They were two different generations of gods trying to figure out what it meant to lead. The giants had always believed that Atreus was the only being capable of uniting the realms, because he was a being of two worlds. He had the strength of the Aesir and the wisdom of the Jötnar, a combination that made him the perfect bridge for a unified universe. He didn't see the other realms as subjects to be ruled, but as partners to be empowered. His vision for Ragnarok wasn't about a pile of bodies, but about a coalition of the wronged. He was a god who found his power in his connection to others, a philosophy that was the direct opposite of the Allfather's isolationist tyranny. He was the future of the realms, and he was ready to fight for it. The tension between the rescue mission and the war was the central drama of the final campaign. Atreus wanted to save the soul of the mountain and the souls of the giants, believing that the war was just a means to an end. Kratos, conversely, knew that the war would become the end if they weren't careful. He saw the fire of Ragnarok as a force that couldn't be controlled once it was lit. This disagreement forced the two of them to communicate in a way they never had before. They had to find a balance between the father's caution and the son's ambition, a compromise that would eventually become the foundation for their victory. Atreus's growth into the role of Loki was a transition from a boy who followed runes to a man who understood their power. He learned that being a champion didn't mean doing what the murals said. It meant having the courage to make a choice when the murals were wrong. He realized that his heritage wasn't a burden, but a tool that he could use to build something new. He became a master of the spirit, a being who could communicate with the earth and the animals to find a path through the dark. He was the one who blew the horn and the one who led the army. A boy who had finally found his own voice in the noise of the end. The champion was the one who provided the heart for the rebellion. Without Atreus, the army of the realms would have been just a collection of angry factions. He was the one who gave them a reason to fight together, turning a disaster into a revolution. He saw the world not as it was, but as it could be, a perspective that was his greatest gift to the people. He stood at the front of the line and looked toward the mountain, a god who was ready to be the king his father never wanted to be. He was Loki, and he was the only one who believed that the end of the world could be a good thing. Part 13. Surtur and the Flame. Surtur was the essential battery for the apocalypse, an ancient being whose existence was a countdown to the destruction of the city. As the first fire giant, he resided in the heat of Muspelheim, guarding a flame that was destined to ignite the final fire of the realms. He was a being of pure, elemental focus, a creature that had spent an age waiting for the moment when his nature would be fulfilled. He didn't care about the politics of Asgard or the suffering of the mortals. He only cared about the destiny that was written in his blood. He was the fire that was waiting for the spark, a giant who was ready to become the end. The transformation of Surtur into the entity called Ragnarok required a specific and primordial combination of forces. He needed to merge his flame of Muspelheim with the ice of Sinmara, his wife who resided in the frozen wastes of Niflheim. This combination of the two primal elements was the only force capable of producing a being with the scale and the power to break the walls of Asgard. But Sinmara wasn't willing to sacrifice her heart for a war she didn't believe in. The lore suggests that the heroes had to find a different way to provide the ice, using Kratos' blades to channel the energy of the world into the giant's core. It was a messy, artificial birth for a monster of the end. The resulting being, Ragnarok, was a mindless and towering engine of destruction. It wasn't a man or a giant anymore, but a physical manifestation of the apocalypse itself. It was a creature of lava and obsidian that stood higher than the mountains, its only purpose to physically impale and ignite the realm of Asgard. It was the physical consequence of the Allfather's crimes, a force that couldn't be bribed, reasoned with, or stopped. It moved through the sky like a falling star, a dark light that was the final word in the history of the Aesir. It was the fire that Groa had seen in her dreams, and it was finally arrived. Surtur's sacrifice was a moment of profound clinical tragedy. He knew that by becoming Ragnarok, he was ending his own existence and the existence of the world he knew. But he accepted his destiny because he understood that the cycle of the universe required a final cleansing. He was the gardener who was burning the dead wood to make room for the new growth. He didn't hate the gods. He simply knew that their time was up. He moved toward the mountain with a rhythmic, heavy stride, his every step a vibration that was felt in every realm. He was the master of the flame, and he was the one who would deliver the final blow. The presence of the Ragnarok being on the battlefield was the final sign that the All-Father's defenses were useless. No wall could hold back a being of that scale, and no army could stop a force of that heat. The Aesir warriors, who had spent their lives believing they were the masters of the world, looked up and saw the face of their own extinction. The fire of Surtur was a light that revealed the truth of their vulnerability. It was a moment of pure, focused terror that broke the resolve of the mountain. The city wasn't just falling, it was being unmade by the very energy that had birthed the cosmos. The giants had always understood that the destruction of Asgard would require a force that was beyond the reach of the gods. They had recorded the destiny of Surtur in their shrines, knowing that he was the only one who could finish the job. They saw the fire as a gift to the future, a necessary destruction that would clear the path for the boy. Surtur was the battery, the flame, and the end. He stood in the center of the city and pushed his blade into the core of the realm, a final act of service that left the world in a state of chaotic, beautiful fire. He was the giant of the south, and he was the one who had finally turned the lights out in Asgard. Part 14. Jormungandr and Thor. The prophecy of the mutual destruction of the thunder god and the world serpent was the most physical and violent part of the final battle. Thor and Jormungandr were two beings whose destinies had been intertwined since the beginning of the Norse world. They represented the two different sides of the blood feud, the enforcer of the mountain and the guardian of the lake. When they finally met in the ruins of Asgard, the conflict was a display of raw cosmic power that threatened to tear the realms apart. They fought with a hatred that was thousands of years old, a struggle that was the final expression of the war between the fathers and the sons. During the climax of the fight, Thor struck the serpent with such immense force that the fabric of reality began to splinter. Mimir confirmed that the blow was so powerful, it actually cracked the Yggdrasil, sending a shockwave through the world tree that opened a window in time. Jormungandr was hit so hard that he was sent back through this rift, arriving in the era of Midgard centuries before his own birth. This effectively removed the serpent from the current battle, but it fulfilled the loop that allowed Atreus to birth him in the first place. It was a masterpiece of cosmic engineering, a being who was his own ancestor and a soldier who had already fought the war before it started. The specific tragedy of Thor and Jormungandr was that they were both prisoners of a fate they couldn't control. Thor was the blunt instrument of a father who didn't love him, and the serpent was the protector of a race that was already dead. They were the two strongest beings in the 9 realms, and they were destined to spend eternity killing each other. Every blow they landed was a vibration in the world's clock, a noise that signaled the end of the age. They weren't fighting for a cause. They were fighting because the murals said they had to. They were the two pillars of the old world, and they were the ones who would crumble together. Jormungandr's presence in the past was the reason the ghost of Sparta was able to navigate the Lake of Nine. He provided the information and the transportation that the heroes needed, acting as a guide for the man who would eventually birth him. He was a silent witness to his own history, a being who remembered a future that hadn't happened yet. He knew exactly what was going to happen in the final battle, because he had already lived through it. He was the ultimate survivor, a giant who had found a way to stay in the world by moving through the side door of time. He was a loop of spirit and scale that Odin could never manage. The blow from Thor's hammer was the final word in their relationship. It was a moment of pure, undirected violence that proved the thunder. God was the most powerful being the Aesir had ever produced, but it was also a moment of failure. As the strike didn't kill the serpent, It only moved him. Thor had tried to end the threat, and he had only succeeded in ensuring its existence. He stood in the wreckage of the city and looked at the empty space where the snake had been. A man who had won the fight but lost the war. He was a god who was reaching the end of his usefulness, a weapon that was starting to crack under the weight of its own power. The mutual destruction of the two titans was the signal that the old world was being unmade. They were the representatives of the two different ways of being a god, the enforcer and the guardian. When they were both removed from the board, the world was left to the smaller, more human characters. The giants had recorded this outcome centuries before, knowing that the removal of the serpent and the hammer was the only way to give the boy a chance. They saw the loop as a gift to the future, a way to ensure that the secrets of the past would always be there to guide the heroes. The snake was gone, the hammer was broken, and the final act was ready to begin. Part 15. Heimdall and the Horn. Heimdall stood as the primary watchman of the mountain, a god whose senses were so sharp he could hear the grass grow and see the intent in a man's heart. He was the most loyal of the Aesir, a being who viewed the Allfather's safety as the highest law in the cosmos. His arrogance was built on his absolute belief that no one could ever strike him, as his foresight allowed him to anticipate every movement before it happened. He moved through the halls of Asgard with a biting condescension, viewing the other realms as messy distractions that needed to be managed with a heavy hand. He was the herald of the end, the god who held the Gjallarhorn, and the key to the sequence of events that would eventually burn his home. The Allfather used Heimdall's loyalty to perform the most desperate of his defensive maneuvers. He ordered the Watchmen to steal the moon from the sky, believing that by removing the celestial body, he could pause the countdown of the prophecy indefinitely. Heimdall didn't question the logic of the order. He simply saw it as another task in the defense of his king. He hid the moon within the borders of Asgard, creating a cosmic imbalance that began to warp the energy of the other realms. He was a god who was perfectly comfortable breaking the universe if it meant he could buy his master one more day of life. He was the cold instrument of a paranoid strategy, a man who saw the end coming and thought he could stare it down. The horn itself was the most significant relic in Heimdall's possession, a tool that was destined to signal the start of the final war. The Allfather had spent centuries trying to ensure the horn remained silent, yet he kept the man who held it closer than his own sons. This was the central irony of Heimdall's existence. The god whose entire purpose was to announce the end was also the god most invested in ensuring it never arrived. He guarded the Gjallarhorn with a feral intensity, knowing that its sound would be the last thing he ever heard in his physical form. He was the gatekeeper of a disaster, a being who sat on the wall and watched the horizon for the first spark of the fire. When Kratos and the heroes eventually arrived to reclaim the moon, Heimdall saw the confrontation as the final proof of his own superiority. He believed that his ability to see the Spartans' intent would make the fight a simple exercise in humiliation. But the lore tells us that the Spartan brought a weapon that Heimdall's senses couldn't manage, the Draupnir spear. The spear didn't rely on a single strike, but on a sudden, overwhelming explosion of sound and pressure. For a god who lived through his senses, the spear was a sensory overload that blinded his foresight. Kratos didn't just beat the Watchman, he dismantled the very things that made him a god, proving that even a herald can be silenced. The death of Heimdall was the moment the Allfather truly became blind to the threats within his own city. By losing his Watchman, the king lost the ability to anticipate the moves of the rebellion before they reached the walls. Kratos killed the god in a display of focus, necessary violence, taking the Gjallarhorn from his cold hands. It wasn't an act of revenge, but a tactical requirement to ensure the war could begin on the hero's terms. As Heimdall fell, the silence of Asgard was replaced by the noise of a world that was finally waking up. The herald was gone, and the end was no longer a distant threat, but a physical reality that was already at the gate. Heimdall's fall proved that the defenses of the Aesir were built on a foundation of intellectual pride. He had believed he was untouchable because he could see the future, unaware that a man with enough resolve can change the future with a single choice. His death blinded the Allfather and signaled the beginning of the final act of the prophecy. The horn was now in the hands of the boy. And the sequence of events was moving faster than any watchman could track. Heimdall had spent his life guarding a wall, and he died realizing that the wall had already been breached from the inside. He was the first major pillar of Asgard to break, a sacrifice to a prophecy he had tried to outrun. Section 5. The Events of Ragnarok, Part 16. The Moon Restored. The restoration of the moon to the sky was the moment the cosmic clock of the world resumed its final, rhythmic tick. Atreus travelled to the hidden reaches of the heavens to find the celestial body that Heimdall had stolen, a mission that was the first step in his role as the champion. When he released the moon from its magical cage and returned it to its natural path, he wasn't just performing a task of balance. He was activating the script that the giants had written thousands of years earlier. The moon didn't just return to the sky. It triggered a celestial eclipse that was felt in every corner of the 9 realms, a dark light that signaled the end of the Allfather's law. This eclipse was the visual signal that the fixed points of the prophecy were now in motion. As the shadow covered the sun, Skoll and Hati were finally allowed to finish the hunt they had started at the beginning of time. Atreus shot a magical arrow into the sky, breaking the lingering restraints of the Aesir and guiding the wolf giants to their prey. This wasn't an act of destruction, but an act of liberation for the natural order of the universe. The sun and moon were consumed, and the realms were plunged into the great darkness that the seers had predicted. The boy had pulled the final pin on the grenade, and the world was ready for the explosion. The return of the celestial cycle was the point of no return for every player in the war. Once the sky went dark, the Allfather realized that his attempts to delay the end had failed completely. He had spent centuries caging the wolves and hiding the moon, only to have a boy with a bow dismantle his entire defense in a single night. The darkness was a weight on the hearts of the Aesir, a reminder that the universe didn't belong to them anymore. It was the signal for the army of the realms to begin their march, a transition from a cold war of surveillance to a hot war of fire and steel. The script was active, and the actors were moving to their positions. Atreus's choice to restore the moon was a moment of profound maturity for the young god. He knew that by fulfilling the prophecy, he was inviting a war that would claim the lives of many people he cared about. But he also understood that a world held in a state of arrested motion was a world that was already dead. He chose the fire of the end over the ice of the Allfather's control, a decision that proved he was the leader the Jotunheim seers had always anticipated. He was the one who restarted the clock, a boy who had finally found the courage to be the champion of the truth. He was Loki, and he had just turned the lights out. The lore suggests that the restoration of the moon was a masterpiece of giants' magic. It was a lock that only a being with the blood of the giants could open, a safeguard that ensured the Allfather could never restart the cycle himself. The eclipse was a bridge between the 3 years of Fimbulwinter and the final fire of Ragnarok. It provided the cover needed for the army of the realms to move through the world tree, a shadow that blinded the ravens of Asgard. The celestial hunt was over, and the celestial war was beginning. The moon was back in its place, and the end was arriving with a speed that defied every divine calculation. The great darkness that followed was the silence before the storm. It was a period of intense spiritual focus for Kratos and his companions as they prepared for the final assault on the mountain. They saw the eclipse not as a sign of doom, but as a sign of progress. They knew that the Allfather was terrified of the dark, and they were ready to use that fear against him. The sequence of events had passed the point where anyone could stop it, a realization that gave the heroes a sense of calm in the middle of the chaos. The sky was black, the wolves were satisfied, and the horn was ready to be blown. The end was no longer a myth. It was a physical fact. Part 17. The Army of the Realms. The coalition that united to face the Allfather was a group of the wronged, an army of disparate factions that had been brought together by the vision of the champion. Atreus and the god Tyr had spent months building the political alliances necessary to move a unified force through the world tree. It wasn't a simple gathering of soldiers, but a revolution of the subservient realms against the tyranny of the mountain. The elves of Alfheim provided the air support, their light and shadow moving as a single force for the first time in history. The dwarves of Svartalfheim provided the siege engines and the technology. Their industrial might finally turned against the man who had exploited them. The Vanir resistance, led by Freya and her brother Freya, was the magical heart of the invasion. They brought the power of nature and the secrets of the Cider to the walls of the city, creating a landscape that the Aesir couldn't easily defend. It was a moment of profound historical justice for the people of Vanaheim, who had spent generations living under the shadow of the Allfather's curse. They weren't fighting for land or for gold. They were fighting for the right to breathe without the Allfather's permission. This unity of the realms was a miracle of diplomacy that the seers of Jotunheim had recorded as the only way to break the power of Asgard. The freed people of Midgard also joined the march, a collection of raiders and survivors who had seen their world destroyed by the winter. They brought a raw, human desperation to the battlefield, a reminder that the war wasn't just about the gods, but about the lives of the mortals who had been used as pawns. Kratos led this diverse force with a clinical, Spartan discipline, turning a collection of angry factions into a focused engine of war. He wasn't interested in the glory of the command. He was interested in the results of the strike. He was the general of the revolution, the man who had the experience to lead an army against a mountain. The logistics of moving an army through the world tree required a level of magical coordination that only the Huldra brothers could provide. They used the secret paths and the ancient energy of the roots to bypass the Allfather's surveillance, arriving at the walls of Asgard before the king could organize his defenses. This was the first time in history that the subservient realms had acted with a single will, a fact that proved Ragnarok was a political change rather than a universal disaster. It was the sound of the universe saying no to a single, suffocating master. The army was a mirror of the Allfather's failure, a collection of every heart he had broken and every kingdom he had ruined. Odin's reaction to the arrival of the army was a mix of disbelief and tactical panic. He had spent centuries trying to keep the realms divided, using his ravens and his whispers to ensure that they never worked together. He couldn't imagine a world where the elves and the dwarves stood on the same side of a battlefield. He saw the coalition as a virus that was attacking the body of his empire, a variable that he hadn't accounted for in his defense of the city. He realized that the big lie of a universal apocalypse had backfired, as the realms were now united by their shared desire to survive him. The army was at his gate, and the city was alone. The final assault on the walls of Asgard was a display of combined arms that overwhelmed the Aesir defenders. The magic of the Vanir broke the protective staves, the engines of the dwarves shattered the stone, and the resolve of the heroes led the charge through the breach. It was a war of the many against the one. A struggle that proved that the power of a unified people is greater than the power of a single god. Atreus stood at the center of the storm, the champion who had finally brought the world together to finish the story. The army of the realms was the final word in the history of the Aesir, a revolution that was written in the blood of the mountain. Part 18. The Fall of Asgard. The final battle on the mountain was the moment the physical and spiritual heart of the Aesir was unmade by the fire of the end. As the army of the realms breached the outer defenses, the fire giant Surtur arrived in his transformed state as the entity called Ragnarok. He was a mindless, towering engine of destruction that stood higher than the walls of the city. His only purpose to physically impale and ignite the core of the realm. He didn't distinguish between a soldier and a palace. He was a force of nature that was fulfilling a destiny that predated the gods themselves. He pushed his massive blade into the center of Asgard, a strike that sent a wave of liquid fire through the streets and the halls of the Great Lodge. The deaths of the key Olympians during the struggle were the final signs of the collapse of the divine hierarchy. Heimdall's fall had already blinded the king, and the death of Thor was the final wound to the heart of the Aesir. Thor was murdered by the Allfather himself in a moment of pure, desperate rage, a father killing his own son because the son refused to be a tool any longer. This act of domestic violence was the ultimate proof of the rot in the house of the king. It broke the resolve of the remaining Aesir warriors, who realized that their loyalty was being given to a man who would kill his own blood to save his own skin. The city wasn't just burning, it was falling apart from the inside. Asgard wasn't destroyed in a natural sense, but was unmade by the primordial energy of the fire giant. The realm didn't just crumble, it exploded into 1,000,000 pieces of stone and magic that were scattered across the other 8 realms. These Asgardian remnants became a physical legacy of the disaster, a collection of ruins that would serve as a warning for centuries to come. The high peak of the cosmos was gone, replaced by a void in the center of the world tree. The era of the mountain was over, and the gods who had claimed to be the masters of the world were now just names in a book of the dead. It was the end of a specific system of control, a fire that had cleared the path for the future. The death of the Allfather in the ruins of his city was a pathetic conclusion to a life of immense ambition. He didn't go out in a blaze of glory or a grand battle, but in a basement surrounded by the shadows of the secrets he had tried to keep. He had chosen the mask and the rift over his family and his people, and he died realizing that the rift held no answers for him. He was a god who had been hollowed out by his own greed, a king who had lost his kingdom because he was too busy trying to find a way to leave it. He was a man who had built a wall of lies, and the wall had finally fallen on top of him. Surtur's role as the destroyer was the fulfillment of a prophecy that the giants had guarded since the time of the Ginnungagap. They knew that the fire was the only way to ensure the end of the Aesir's influence. The burning of the realm was a cleansing force that removed the stain of the Allfather's rule from the fabric of the universe. The other realms watched as the light of the fire filled the sky, realizing that the weight of the mountain was finally gone. It was a disaster, yes, but it was a disaster that brought a sense of relief to a world that had been holding its breath for 300 years. The age of the gods was over, and the age of the world was beginning. The fall of Asgard was the moment the 9 realms became the 8 realms. The geography of the cosmos had changed, and the old order was a memory. The survivors of the war were left to rebuild in a landscape that was finally their own. The fire had gone out, but the warmth of the sun was starting to return to the world. Kratos and Atreus stood in the wreckage and looked at the future, a father and a son who had finally finished the war that Faye had started. They had broken the city and killed the king, and now they were the only ones left to decide what happens next. Asgard was gone, and the world was finally, beautifully free. Part 19. Odin's last move. In the final and desperate moments of the war, the All-Father retreated to the dark basement of his lodge, still clutching the broken fragments of the mask. He didn't care about the fire in his streets or the death of his son. His mind was entirely focused on the green light of the rift. He believed that even now he could find the source code that would allow him to transcend the end. He was a man who had completely lost touch with the physical reality of his defeat, choosing a ghost of knowledge over the survival of his family. He tried to bargain with Atreus one last time, offering the boy a place in a new universe if he would just finish the translation. He was a predator who was trying to be a mentor until the very last second. The choice of the All-Father to prioritize the mask was the final proof of his moral bankruptcy. He was a being of pure, unadulterated self-interest, a god who had never loved anyone but his own reflection in the pool of wisdom. When Atreus finally chose to break the mask and close the rift, the All-Father's world ended in a psychological explosion of despair. He realized that there was no escape hatch and no higher truth. He was just an old man in a cold room, facing a father and a son who had more heart than he ever possessed. He had lost his game, and the silence of the rift was the only answer he was ever going to get. The capture of the All-Father's soul was an act of giant's magic that turned the most powerful being in the realms into a small, cold object. Atreus trapped the king's spirit in a giant's marble, a physical container that was designed to hold the essence of a soul for eternity. It was a moment of profound justice, a being of infinite ego reduced to a pocket-sized secret. For a few seconds, it appeared that the heroes might offer the All-Father a trial or a chance at redemption, but the world had seen enough of the king's trials and his redemptions. There was no room for him in the new world, and there was no one left who believed his lies. The final, permanent death of the All-Father was delivered by Sindri, the grieving blacksmith who had spent 2 games staying out of the conflict. Sindri didn't care about the prophecy, the champion, or the future of the realms. He only cared about his brother, Brok, who had been murdered by the All-Father's hand. He took the marble and crushed it with a single focused act of revenge, ending the existence of the king of the Aesir forever. This was the ultimate irony of the All-Father's reign. His end didn't come from a prophesied champion or a god-killer, but from a small person he had underestimated his entire life. He had been erased by the very kind of person he had viewed as a disposable tool. Sindri's intervention was a moment of pure human consequence that bypassed the mechanics of the prophecy. It showed that the All-Father's rule was ended not by the stars, but by the weight of the misery he had caused. He had spent his life managing the big variables of the world, and he had been undone by a single broken heart. The death of the All-Father was a quiet, intimate thing, a snap of a stone in a dusty room. He was gone, and the weight of his surveillance and his tyranny went with him. The world was free of the Watcher, and the people were free to be themselves. The blacksmith had finished the war that the gods had started. The lore suggests that the permanent death of the Allfather was the only way the world could ever truly heal. As long as he existed, even in a soul stone, he would have found a way to manipulate the future. By crushing the marble, Sindri ensured that the cycle was truly broken. The heroes were left with a world that was empty of a king, a realization that was both terrifying and beautiful. They had survived the end of the age, and they had seen the master of the world turned into dust. The Allfather's last move had been a failure, and the final word was spoken by a man with a hammer. The king was dead, and the world was finally alone. Section 6. What it all meant. Part 20. Prophecy versus free will. The final conclusion of the Norse saga is a thematic position on the nature of destiny. Prophecy is only true if people remain predictable. For centuries, the Allfather had used the murals and the seers as a script for his rule, believing that the future was a track that he couldn't leave. He saw Kratos as a god-killer because the murals said so, and he saw Atreus as a champion because the shrines were already painted. But the heroes realized that the giant's vision wasn't a set of instructions, but a collection of possibilities. They proved that the threads of fate are not made of iron, but of the choices that people make in the moments when they are most afraid. The most significant moment of free will in the entire story was when Kratos chose to spare Thor rather than finish the duel to the death. The murals in Jotunheim had shown Kratos as a man of rage who would kill the thunder god and eventually die in the arms of his son. By choosing to be kind to Thor and offering him a different path, Kratos broke the cycle of violence that had defined his life since the days of Greece. He proved that he wasn't the monster that the Allfather wanted him to be, and he wasn't the victim the giants had predicted. He changed his nature, and by doing so, he changed the future. He was a man who had finally found the strength to say no to the script. Faye's true plan, revealed in the final moments of the series, was never about ensuring a specific outcome. She had destroyed the final panel of Atreus's mural specifically to give her husband and son the choice to be better. She knew that if they saw their victory, they would become just as arrogant as the Aesir. By keeping the future hidden, she forced them to rely on their own morality and their own love for each other. She wanted them to arrive at the end of the world, not as actors in a play, but as free men who were making their own way. She had gambled everything on the idea that they were more than just the sum of their prophecies. This thematic shift from fate to agency is what separates the Norse era from the Greek era. In Greece, Kratos was a man who was fighting against the Sisters of Fate, only to find that every move he made was a part of their design. In the Nine Realms, he learned that fate is just a story that people tell themselves to avoid responsibility. He realized that the only thing that is inevitable is the consequence of one's actions. This realization was the greatest victory he ever achieved. He didn't just kill a god, he killed the idea of a predetermined life. He was a free man standing in the ruins of a city that had been built on a lie. The choice to be better was a message that resonated with every survivor of the war. They saw that the end of Asgard was a chance for every realm to redefine its own destiny. They weren't bound by the Allfather's law or the giant's vision. They were free to build a world that was based on cooperation and justice, a future that didn't have a map. The prophecy had been a tool to dismantle the old world, but it wasn't a blueprint for the new one. The people were the ones who would have to write the next chapter, a realization that gave them a sense of hope that no god could ever provide. The murals were finished, and the reality was just beginning. The legacy of the war is the proof that the individual has more power than the stars. Kratos, Atreus, Freya, and even Thor made choices that defied the expectations of the mountain. They proved that the heart is a variable that no seer can fully track. The All-Father had lost because he thought he was playing against a machine, and he was actually playing against a family. The future was an open door, and the heroes were the ones who had the courage to walk through it. The prophecy was over. The choice had been made, and the Spartan was finally, beautifully, the master of his own soul. He had broken the loop, and the world was finally his to lead. Part 21. The 9 realms after the world that emerged from the fire of Ragnarok was a landscape of intense rebuilding and quiet hope. With Asgard gone and the All-Father permanently erased, the weight of a 300-year system of control was finally lifted from the shoulders of the universe. The most immediate change was felt in Midgard, where the 3-year Fimbulwinter began to thaw. The ice on the Lake of Nine cracked, and the sun returned to the sky, a natural cycle that had been denied to the people for far too long. The spring that followed wasn't just a season, but a visual signal that the world was finally allowed to breathe again. The earth was waking up, and the people were waking up with it. Mimir noted in the final days that the realms were finally free of the suffocating grip of the Aesir. Without the industrial quotas of the dwarves, or the endless border skirmishes of the elves, the other realms began to find their own balance. The elves of Alfheim entered a tentative and fragile peace, attempting to find a way to share the light without the interference of a divine master. The dwarves of Svartalfheim returned to their forges, no longer as slaves to the All-Father's war machine, but as craftsmen who were working for their own prosperity. The world was becoming a decentralized community of equals, a future that Tyr had always dreamed of. The aftermath of the war was also a time of profound, personal transition for the heroes. Atreus left on his journey to find the remaining soul stones of his people, becoming the wandering god of the giants. Kratos stayed in Midgard, no longer as a god-killer in hiding, but as a guardian who was helping to rebuild the world he had helped destroy. He saw that his legacy wasn't the bodies he had left behind, but the world he was helping to protect. He was a man who had finally found a version of home in the ruins of a tragedy. He wasn't a Spartan general or an Olympian king. He was a father who had done right by his son. The lore could tell that the end of Ragnarok was the beginning of the world the giants had always been preparing for. They hadn't sought the destruction of life, but the destruction of a system that was based on fear and manipulation. By clearing the board, they had given the 9 realms a chance to grow into something new. The future was no longer a recording in a shrine, but a journey that was being lived by every soul in the cosmos. The survival of the spirit was the ultimate victory of the Jötnar, a legacy that was being carried by the boy into the farthest reaches of the world. The world was free, and the story was finally theirs to write. A tentative council of realms was formed to manage the transition, a move away from the authority of a single All-Father. This council, led by figures like Freya and Tyr, sought to foster a sense of mutual respect and cooperation between the different factions. They knew that the wounds of the past would take a long time to heal, but they were committed to the process of building a world that was based on the truth. They were the gardeners of the New Age, a generation of gods who were servants of the people rather than their masters. They had seen the worst of the old world, and they were ready to work for the best of the new one. In the end, Ragnarok proved to be the end of an age, rather than the end of the world. It was the fire that cleared the dead wood to make room for the new growth. The 9 realms were still there, scarred and broken, but they were also full of a potential that had been missing for centuries. The people were the ones who held the light, and the future was a path they would walk together. Kratos stood on the cliff and watched the sun set, a man who had finally found the peace he had been searching for since the beginning. The Allfather was gone, the city was unmade, and the world was finally, beautifully, awake